Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pedro, and you are now tuned into the Alpha Success Network. And over the next few minutes, we are going to explore a very, very powerful subject. We are going to be talking about trauma. And before I get into the conversation here today, I want to ask you a question. And the question goes something like this. Have you noticed in your life that you are plagued with a multitude of anxieties and fears which you do not know the origin of? Now, unless you are enlightened, there's a very, very good chance that you are plagued by a multitude of fears and anxieties. And I do believe that one of the sources or the origins of these fears and anxieties that majority of people experience on a day-to-day basis comes from trauma. Now, there are three levels to trauma: physical trauma, emotional trauma, and spiritual trauma. In today's video, I am going to focus on physical trauma, and over the next few weeks, I'm going to create more videos that address the other two types of trauma: emotional trauma and spiritual trauma. I do wholeheartedly believe that unless you familiarize yourself with these three types of traumas, you are going to find it very difficult to eliminate any fears and anxieties that you have. And the more fears and anxieties that you have in your life, the more difficult it's going to be for you to express yourself to the world. You know what I'm saying? Show up and show out to the world and achieve and manifest a life of true health, happiness, and prosperity. So eliminating or transcending trauma is a very, very important subject. So with that being said, I want to talk to you today about physical trauma. And I want you to understand that physical trauma happens both to men and women. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you some symptoms which I want you to observe and see if you have these symptoms. And if you exhibit the symptoms, then you have some sort of physical trauma. And I'm also going to share with you in this video some things that you can do to reduce the amount of physical trauma that you experience so that you can begin to accelerate your personal growth and development. I'm going to talk about both men and women. So I'm going to kick off with my own story first and foremost. As a man, born in Africa, Kenya to be specific. And when I was growing up, I do recollect that I was beaten up a lot when I was growing up. But this is normal. I mean, to us, it's normal in Africa. Like, our parents actually beat us. It's not like in the Western society whereby if your dad beats you, you pick up the phone and call, I believe it's social child services or something like that. It doesn't happen like that in Africa. So we get so used to being beaten up growing up, and we just think it's normal. Now, when I came to the Western world, when I came to Canada, I began to notice that I was almost always in a state of physical anxiety, shock. I had a lot of body armor on my chest, and I was always in a state of perpetual fear, right? And through my own personal growth and development, I noticed that this state of perpetual fear came about from the shock that my physical body had experienced from repeated physical abuse from my father when I was growing up, like repeatedly being beaten up. You know what I'm saying? Brutal beatings. And that is how I discovered that one develops trauma in their physical body if they have gone through some sort of physical abuse when they're growing up, like during their childhood when they're growing up. So I want you to observe yourself. For the men, I'm going to talk about women very, very shortly. But for the men, I want you to observe yourself and notice the signs of trauma. And the signs of trauma are going to show up by you having a lot of tension in your body. So if you're constantly like this, or if there's a lot of tension on your chest, you cannot breathe, it means that you have experienced a lot of trauma, right? I have a friend of mine who I seen the other day, and he had these symptoms of where his shoulders were very, very tight, his chest was very, very tight. And I immediately knew that he had been in some sort of trauma. And on talking to him, I discovered that at one time he was a part of a gang. And when he was part of a gang, he got beat up a lot. There was a lot of physical violence involved with being part of a gang. So that is the sign to look out for the men. Now for the women, this is how I discovered that a woman has experienced physical trauma. And physical trauma for women typically happens in one of two ways. There might be more ways, but this is what I have observed. Number one is they have experienced domestic violence, right? They have dated someone who repeatedly beat them up. So that would be a sign of, that would lead to physical trauma, right? Because the body is in a constant state of shock. And another one that is more subtle is physical trauma that results from, I want to call it sexual trauma. I want to call it sexual trauma. And in the West, I do believe that women experience a significant amount of sexual trauma because they actually begin to engage in sexual activities at a very young age. I meet women here in Canada that had sex when they were like 13, 12 years old. And where I come from in Africa, it's not normal for people to have sex before the ages of 18, right? There's a lot of sheltering. You know, you have to be home by 4 p.m. when you leave school, so there's no room for you to maneuver and engage in activities that actually result in one having sex at a young age. So when a woman begins to have sex at a young age, 12 and 13, majority of the time, okay, this is my suspicion, majority of the time it is not by her own consent, right? It is usually a situation whereby a man either forces himself on the woman or uses powerful conversation, the gift of gab, to get a woman to sleep with him. You know what I'm saying? Even if it's a teenage male talking to a woman who's like 12 or 13 years old, the man is usually so smooth that he gets a woman to have sex with the man. And what happens is that at this early age, I suspect, I do not know for a fact, but I suspect that the female's sexual organ hasn't been fully developed, and that leads to some sort of physical trauma. So I started discovering this for myself here in Canada when I had sexual experiences with, it happened twice. I had a sexual experience with two women, and when I had a sexual experience with these two women, I noticed that they could not get wet in the bedroom. They could not get wet in the bedroom, and I thought that this was very, very strange. And after I spoke to them later on, I discovered that they had begun engaging in sexual activities at a young age, and they had actually been sexually abused when they were younger, right? So for the women, I want you to actually just notice if there are issues showing up in the bedroom in terms of your comfort and your ability to engage with the male energy. So if there's an issue showing up, especially around your sexual organs, then that is a very, very clear sign that there is a form of physical trauma, right? And the other situation of physical trauma that I've seen women experience is a situation where they have been involved in a relationship and they got beat up. And this one, the signs are actually very, very clear. The woman, after living this type of relationship, has a very, very, has a significant amount of anger. And this type of women typically begin to work out a lot. I'm not saying this is the rule, but I notice they work out a lot and they begin to build a lot of muscle because they want to protect themselves from future physical abuse. Okay? So these are just my observations. There's no right or wrong. I'm sharing with you what I've observed in terms of physical trauma in men and in women. And if you notice that you have experienced, if you notice that you have physical trauma in your body due to any form of physical abuse, then it's very, very important to begin to engage in certain practices to free up the energy that is blocked in your body, that is creating a lot of tension, which leads to a high level of anxiety and a high level of continuous fear. So on my journey towards healing my own physical trauma, I engaged in quite a variety of processes. Bodywork, I like to say bodywork. So for example, I did rolfing. I'm just going to mention these and I want you to go and research them yourself. I engaged in rolfing, which is a certain type of invasive massage. I'm using the term invasive, but it's just a very, very deep type of massage that releases the body armor that one has accumulated due to physical trauma. Okay? So rolfing is a really, really good tool to use. I constantly use shiatsu massage. I have found that to be a very, very powerful practice to eliminate tension in the body. Yoga is a very, very, very powerful tool that you can use to eliminate tension in the body that is resulting from physical trauma. So the main thing is to look for wellness practices revolving around bodywork. This can really, really help. And for women that may have experienced, sexual abuse, sexual trauma, I definitely do know that Tantra practices with a very well qualified Tantra practitioner can help a woman free up the energy that is blocked in her sexual organs, in her first and her second chakra, right? So these are different bodywork practices that I have personally gone through. I haven't gone through. No, these are bodywork practices that I have personally used myself, and the Tantra practices for the women are modalities that I know other women that are close to me have used and are using to eliminate the sexual trauma that they have experienced in their life. So this is a very, very powerful subject. I want you to really begin to observe what kind of fears and anxieties that you're experiencing. And like I said, there are levels to trauma. There's physical, emotional, and spiritual. In today's conversation, I just wanted to talk about physical trauma. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to explore deeper levels of trauma in terms of emotional and spiritual. But with the physical levels of trauma, you can immediately begin to do a few things to reduce the impact of the trauma that you have experienced physically, which is causing a certain type of body energy, a certain type of blockage of energy. Physical trauma is causing a certain type of body armor, which is causing blockages in the flow of energy within your being. So just Google bodywork and you'll find a lot of bodywork practices, and you'll find one that suits you. It may be shiatsu, it may be rolfing, it may be a certain Chinese massage, it may be yoga, it may be tantra. Do your research and find out the best that will work for you, and immediately begin to heal yourself. Have yourselves an amazing day, and stay tuned. The next installation we will talk about emotional trauma. Adios.